Welcome to another season recap episode of the Sports Daily College Basketball Podcast. Tonight, we are doing the Rutgers Scarlet Knights, 13th place in the Big Ten. I'm your host, Sean Vowells, and as usual, I'm joined by Joe Meade. Joe, we have got Rutgers, 13th place in the Big Ten, an extremely on-brand Rutgers season from the analytics perspective. Really, really poor offense. Elite top-of-the-line defense. Rutgers ends up finishing 13th on a tiebreaker. Overall thoughts on Steve Pikiell and the Scarlet Knights season?
I do think a lot of the reality of what the season was going to be got distorted, getting those top five players in the offseason. I think there was a lot of excitement generated around the program, but I do think fan base expectations were decently realistic with this team. I think the expectation was to maybe be in contention for the tournament, and sadly, they fell short of that. But overall, I do not think fans feel in any way panicked nor discouraged about the direction of the program. I do think they still believe in Steve Pikiell. They still believe in his vision. And like you said, Sean, that's because nothing really changed in Rutgers' play style. They have an identity. They stuck to it. And I think they just didn't have the horses to carry it this year.
Yeah, obviously with the late transfer of Cam Spencer to UConn, they weren't really able to fill his spot. And they had, Jamichael Williams, who was ruled ineligible until February. He only played 12 games. He had injury to Mawat Mag. He had a couple other role players missing games. On top of not having a whole lot of talent to begin with, I think it makes sense as to why Rutgers finished in the Wednesday places of the Big Ten. And, they're still tough to beat at home. They ended up being 12-5 at the rack. Still able to beat some tournament teams there. 15-17 overall, 7-13 in the Big Ten. Obviously, the overall win-loss you expect to be a little better, but 7-13 is not very far off from where we thought they'd be. And we thought that might be a few places higher in the Big Ten, but there was a lot of mid in the Big Ten this year, and Rutgers just ends up on the wrong end of it due to a tiebreaker loss to Maryland. And after all, they were just 3 games away from 6th, so they were a couple of close games from being in the top half. But, Joe, let's get into their non-conference because it wasn't this start that the Scarlet Knights were looking for. On opening day in a neutral court game, they did lose to Princeton. Not entirely surprising there. They were only a few point favorites, but, starting the season off with a loss in a game that you should probably win hurts. They ended up beating Georgetown and a couple of other quad 4 games, as the YouTube viewers can see. They did get to 5-1, and then they did lose big to Illinois in their Big Ten opener. They got smacked on the road at Wake Forest. They did beat Seton Hall on the road, and they lost also at the Prudential Center in a neutral court game to Mississippi State. But with the way the non-conference went, Joe, it was, Rutgers dug themselves a pretty deep hole.
Yeah, Sean. And traditionally, Rutgers has dug themselves holes losing, particularly last year, quad 3, quad 4 games. That's probably what cost them the tournament in 22-23.
They were
But
four seed in the Big Ten one year, didn't make it.
yeah, that's crazy. But particularly losing to Princeton opening night, we talked about Michigan in a previous episode. If you haven't listened or clicked on the video, I recommend you do because it's kind of the same story. It kind of went off, not the rails like Michigan season did. Like Rutgers didn't pack it in the same way Michigan did, but the tone for the season was certainly set in the Jersey City Armory. And Sean, you called that a neutral game? Yes, technically it was, but that was primarily Rutgers fans. Our friend Fernando, who we went to high school with, he is a Princeton student as we speak right now. He went to that game. He said there was probably one predominant Princeton section, and he was in it. They actually had to give kids Princeton T-shirts because the school's so studious. No one has time to go to the bookstore and wear their orange and black. But Sean, probably their best win of the non-conference, besides Seton Hall, was Georgetown, that game they had at home. And Seton Hall might have been their best win all year, frankly, on the road against a team that should have been in the tournament.
Yeah,
You know,
it ends as a quad one win because of Seton Hall's NIT championship run. But other than that, Joe, they had a 1 point win against Stonehill, who was, if you can look really closely there, 357,
yeah,
and without their two best players, that would have been a total disaster. But they're behind the eight ball in non-con, and they were never really able to get back in front of it.
yeah, and before the Illinois game in December, we said this was probably their come to life game. Meaning, if they won this, maybe their expectations of making the tournament were still there. Illinois thrashed them pretty thoroughly, followed it up by a 19-point loss at Wake Forest. I know they did beat Seton Hall the next game, but the writing was on the wall. And losing to Miss State in Newark, it is New Jersey, neutral site, but come on, let's just face the facts here. It was downhill from there, and then Rutgers did not do well on the road this year, Sean. They, I believe, won two games. It was against Michigan and Maryland on the road. So, yeah,
Yeah, they were able to beat some of the as we go to the conference season here.
hmm
They were able to beat some of the average teams in the Big Ten at home, like Indiana, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Northwestern. Um, but they were not able to beat the good teams when they were at home, and just 2-8 on the road. You know, it is tough. A lot of red here on this is the Bart Torvik page for the YouTube listeners. A lot of red, and this is the offensive column here. A whole lot of red. That is ultimately what cost them. They did end up 300th in offense. That is especially bad. And in a conference without, a whole lot of good offense this year and plenty of good defense, you're just putting yourself with such a slim margin of error to win basketball games. And they were able to a couple times against the middle of the pack at home, but virtually no road wins, and they were not able to beat the top teams like Illinois and Purdue at home. At the end of the day, Joe, this isn't entirely shocking. Teams have, Rutgers are able to beat teams that are better than them at the rack, but other than that, they did finish 13th. But anything to add here on the conference season? They did win 4 games in a row, got to 6-7, but then just a single win the rest of the way.
No, even you look at the Wisconsin win. I mean, that was when Wisconsin couldn't play basketball, like we talked about in Michigan's season. So, did it really count? Sure, of course it counted, but it wasn't particularly impressive. And that's traditionally something Rutgers has done. They've usually upset teams at home. They've upset a Purdue at home. They've upset a Michigan State at home. They usually had a ridiculously good home record. I believe there were a few years, Sean, they lost 1 or 2 games at the rack. Now Jersey Mike's Arena. It's still the rack to me, but yeah, Sean, it's let's just say next year can't come soon enough for the Scarlet Knights.
Yeah, and that was the case, kind of early on in this one. They only had 3 double-digit scores, and only one of those 3 will be back with the program next year. Jeremiah Williams, called him Jamichael earlier. It's Jamichael Davis, Jeremiah Williams. He will be back, but Andre Hyatt and Cliff Amori, the 2 other double-digit scorers, are headed into the transfer portal. Are some of the veteran role players leaving this team dampening the mood of getting those 2 top 5 recruits for next year?
I don't know if it completely dampens the mood. It kind of limits their potential, though, for next year. I think we'll talk about that in our preview for Rutgers in a few months. But I feel like Rutgers was a program where that would be their next step, getting 2 elite guys to mix in with their Cliff Amoris and Andre Hyatts of the world. I do think them leaving, and along with Simpson, that hurts.
Yeah, it certainly does. Now, they have picked up a couple players in the transfer portal. Again, that's for the season preview. But we'll talk about the players that did leave this team. Gavin Griffiths is headed to Nebraska. Derek Simpson, as you said, in the portal. They've got very few returning players, but, it doesn't get much better of a recruiting class for Rutgers. Now, gone through the non-conference season. We've gone through the conference season. I think there's really one answer here for the best performer and it's the one who's played 4 years of college basketball, is currently in the transfer portal, and he's getting looks from some of the best programs in the country. That's Cliff Amore, elite defender, ends up with double-digit points. He's really the only one who played anywhere near an all Big Ten level.
Yeah, and I do think he's gotten better. I know his stats don't jump out at people like 10 points a game. He is someone who is impossible to defend when he has a clear shot at the basket, so athletic, so long, and so annoying. He tires so many guys out. This is where the Big Ten, just we talked about it with Indiana on certain pods. Uh, that's why having depth is so important. Having a guy like this that could get you in foul trouble and could tire out your starting five, that's a big problem. So I'm hoping for our sake, Sean, as Michigan and Indiana fans, he stays the heck away out of this conference, but has plenty of suitors as we talk right now.
Yeah, you had a couple of those role players that we talked about who didn't really take the step up into the go-to guys that Rutgers kind of needed them to, but they're now gone. So I think it will be an interesting offseason for Steve Peichel, whether he'll change his play style, because really, Joe, offensively, it's been pretty bad to watch. Even in those good Rutgers teams that made the tournament, they were still nowhere near the top. Not even an average offense, Big Ten-wise. So Steve Peichel might have a little bit of, I guess kind of every coach says this every offseason when they have a major roster turnover, and more in the age of the transfer portal that's being the case. But any signs pointing to Peichel maybe switching things up a little bit on the offensive end?
I think he has to at this stage, Sean, especially with two new guys that are going to have to be major contributors on the team. He might, in very non-Steve Peichel-like fashion, he might tell them to roll it out there in a way. I think defense is his forte. I do think it's interesting. I don't know if they've hired any new assistants. I believe they haven't really overhauled the coaching staff that much. It would be interesting to see if they got one guy who just focused solely on offense. I think that was John Beilein's biggest advantage he had at Michigan from 2017 to 2019 when he had Billy Donlin and Luke Yaklich, two guys that were former and went on to be head coaches, mid-major coaches at that. But I do think Steve Peichel should explore doing that. I do think he's a really smart guy. I do not think he's a high ego guy. Certainly he's a program builder, and his way has often been his way or the highway. But I do think on offense, it's about time he did explore that.
And so that'll be the biggest question for them in the offseason. They've really never had the level of recruits that they're getting next year, so perhaps something will change for the Scarlet Knights. Now, Joe, the fifth part of our season recaps is to give a letter grade to these teams. Now, we agreed pretty convincingly on the first recap that we did, which is the Michigan one, as Joe alluded to earlier. If you haven't watched that, please do. But as we get into the middle part of the Big Ten, I think we might have a little bit of disagreement. So I'll let you go first. I've got mine locked in already, a letter grade. We're including pluses and minuses. What are you giving Rutgers for this past season?
I'm gonna give them a C minus shot. I think that's just based on the fact that they didn't necessarily fail, like they failed at their goal, but as a program, this wasn't like a program fail like Michigan's was. F usually means your coach is probably gone, or something completely terrible happened. And again, in that case, your coach would be gone. Steve Peichel, no one was calling for his job. Certainly fans got frustrated, but I think they were able to. They never really lost faith that the engine was going in the right direction or running the right way. So C minus for me.
Yep, I've got it written here too. C minus.
Yep.
The culture was still there. They still played hard. I did go see them beat my Indiana Hoosiers. The fans were still involved. Obviously 13th is no fun, but 7-13 with the talent that they had is not like a crazy underachievement in my opinion. Now, it's an underachievement, but I think a C minus is the way to go for this one. They were slightly under expectations, and those are going to go up a whole lot next year. But Rutgers, 13th place in the Big Ten. That is our season recap for them. Be sure to tune in to the other season recaps that we have already recorded or will record in the future. So thank you everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.